Good evening, everyone. I say evening because it's almost there. The situation that I would like to bring to your attention is Hebrews 11:6. And it says, "But without faith it is impossible." Maybe they can turn the volume down. Hebrews 11:6. "But without faith it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is the rewarder of those who diligently seek him." And this is basically what, in effect, you're about. I'm about here to provide for you more, in a sense, more faith, more substance to your faith. It probably would be a better way for me to put that. I'm here to provide more substance to your faith. People out in the world, faith for them is something that is kind of ethereal. Well, I have faith, That isn't really what God is about. God is about, he has given us an absolute promise of what is going to happen. And that is found in our Bible. Alice, can you bring up my Bible for me, please? And so, as a result of this, this isn't the matter of, well, it's, I feel good about it or something like this. It is here that the guarantee, we heard about that earlier. This is the guarantee. He guarantees it in writing. And so that is an important consideration. So if we would go to the next slide. But it's not changing. Uh-oh. I have to do something, huh? I have to do it myself, huh?
You can hit your space.
Oh, okay. Okay. I expected them. They're changing it up there, and I didn't look up there. I'm looking at my computer. But anyway, it is the glory of God to conceal a matter, but the glory of kings to search out a matter. And that is what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be searching out a matter. Now, you say, well, who do you think you are? You think you're a king? Well, I think that every one of you, in fact, is going to be a king or a priest, aren't you? That's your future. And it's a great future. There is nothing that can be compared to that future. And so this is what we're going to be doing. And the reason we're going to be doing this is because we're going to be looking at the flood of Noah. Now you'd say, well, what has this got to do with, let's say, the calendar or the passage of time? It has a lot to do with that. I read just recently an article by one of the leaders in one of the big groups that are out there, and they said, there is no way that you can establish a calendar from the Bible. There is nothing there that you can do to give you a calendar from the Bible. And I say, that man doesn't understand what is in the Bible. This is the way it is. And when we consider who gave us the Bible, Jesus Christ gave us the Bible, the Word. And that's what we see. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And so we're looking at, today, we're going to be looking at that Word, the information that He left to us. In John 15, and this is something, of course, we're getting close to that time of the year, the Passover, right? And we always read this, and it says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away, and every branch that bears fruit, he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. What does that mean? What should that mean to us? Right, but it means that the Father is the one who is directing our lives. He's putting us into situations whereby we are going to bear more fruit. That's what's happening. And how many of us really, when we're going through difficulties, Mr. O'Brien and I had a meal together last evening, and we talked about the different situations that we went through in our lives. And some of them were pretty nasty, but there was a reason for that. There was a reason for me going through all of those troubles that I went through. And the reason was to develop me into someone that would be useful. And so that's what this is about. And if we, go a little bit further, abide in me, and I in you, as the branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abides in the vine, so neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. He who abides in me and I in him bears much fruit. Apart from me you can do nothing. So we have to recognize that what we are involved in is a dual arrangement. It isn't a case where they're kind of suddenly separated. Here's Christ over here, he's doing something, and the Father, he's over here in doing something. That isn't the way it works. And so this is something that we need to consider. We need to think about this in our lives, in our daily lives, and in fact, in our past life. We think about that and say, I wonder, I went through this bad situation with my job or whatever it was. What was that for? It was to bring you more into his sonship. That's what it was for. This is an important thing. Now, why did I end up, really looking at this thing about Noah? I'll tell you why. It's a very important thing, and you will be able to see how this relationship between the Father and the Son and how they work with us in order to accomplish what they want to accomplish. And what happened is, I was challenged at a previous feast site. Some people were there, and they challenged me. They said, hey, you're keeping the wrong calendar. You do not know what you're doing here. And so I thought, and I take criticism very to heart. I want to know, in other words, I want to know that what I'm doing is the right thing. If I'm doing the wrong thing, I want to change. This is the way I am. And if I make a mistake, I have to own up to that mistake. I can't, just brush it over and cover it up or something like this. I have to admit to that mistake. And this is an important part of being a responsible teacher. As far as I am concerned, that is what it amounts to. And so what happened is, I didn't really know how to approach this idea. First of all, going back a little bit, my knowledge of the calendar, as far as the calendar was zero. I knew, I had heard people talk about the 19-year time cycle, and, I just heard them talk about it, and I thought, don't need to know that. Don't need to know that. That's just extra. Don't clutter up my brain here. And so I completely, at that point in time, knew nothing. And so we had a big flood in the state of Wisconsin. You may have seen on the news, the nightly news, you may have seen a house floating down the river that was in our state. And my granddaughter, in fact, lived in a home that was right below a dam holding up a big lake, and they said, you got to go. They took her out. The police came, and they moved everybody out because they were afraid the dam was going to break. And so it came a couple of weeks, everything quieted down, and I'm thinking about, well, what should I present to the brethren? And I thought, we had this big flood. I'll talk about Noah's flood. This will work just fine for me. And so that's what I did. I opened up the book and I started reading, and I read in there, and I'm reading, and there's all these times that he's putting in. Second month, a certain day, 40 days it rained, 150 more days it rained, and 150 days it took for the water to dry up. And I'm thinking, what do I really care how many days it took? And then this guy Noah, I'm thinking, this guy Noah, he put all this in there, and I'm not really interested in it. And then I thought, I had to rethink this. And I thought, this wasn't Noah's doing, this was God's doing. He put that in there for a reason. Maybe it would be smart if I took the time to find out why it was in there. And so this is, started me off on a 3-year, maybe 3.5-year time frame in which I had to learn about the calendar and about a lot of things. I had to learn about a lot of things because there's a lot of things attached to that calendar. You may not say, well, what do I really care, They tell me, well, this is Passover, and so I go, Well, it's important, really, because there's a lot of very important information in your Bible, and if you think about this, it's in there, and it's important information. Why? God doesn't put things in his Bible for no reason. If you generally, and I'm just as guilty as anyone else, you go to Ezekiel, the first chapter, it gives you all kinds of information. 40 years or 30 years and certain number of months and a certain day and this took place. And, you just read over that. Oh, well, that's good. But it doesn't mean anything. It means nothing. But if you really understood the calendar, then you would know what those dates mean. And they have an important meaning. And all of the books actually fit together. The time elements in these books, they all fit together. One was written by, for instance, the last piece of work I did was about Daniel 9, prophecy of 70 weeks. And I did that work. And involved in that work are all kinds of, many of the books. 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles, Daniel, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. There's another couple of them that are involved in it, which give you time. And they all have to mesh. If they don't mesh, you've got something wrong. God didn't put those dates in there just to exercise his writing skills. And he put them in there for a very important reason. And so, I look at this, and now that it's all over, I can look back and I say, I think God caused that big flood in Wisconsin because he wanted to get my attention. He wanted to point me to this book. You better get your nose in that book and find out what I've written there. And so this is what we're going to be looking at today. But before we even go there, we should go to the book of Genesis. And if we go there, the reason that I want to take you to the book of Genesis, the first chapter, is because there's important information there that reveals to us exactly how God keeps time. Now, it starts in verse 1. The earth was without form and void, and darkness on the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. This is really an important verse because it tells us, the earth existed. It was there. At the time, at the start of the 7-day creation. It was there already. And he continues on, and God saw the light, that it was good, and he divided the light from the darkness, and God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. So the evening and the morning were the first day. And so this is the first key. It's something that you probably haven't thought about. But if you were sitting in the Garden of Eden, which basically this is from the point of view that this was done, the creation was done, and if you were there, but what about the person who was in the opposite side of the earth? You know what happened to that person? Of course, there wasn't one there, but there was a half a day missing, wasn't there? In other words, when sunset started the day, that would have been around 5 or 6 o'clock. That meant on the other side of the earth at 5 or 6 o'clock was the middle of the day. So they missed a half a day. I bet you never thought of that. But this is true. And we have brethren in Australia. You know what? They are finished with their Passover way ahead of us, 12 hours ahead of us. This is the reason. It's not something that man has invented, for time, but this is actually the way it works. So we can see that this is a day. One day. One day is the revolution of the earth. It isn't 24 hours. You see, the scientists today, they think, the earth is slowing down. So now, instead of the day being 24 hours, it's a little less. Well, it really is only one day, because it's one revolution of the earth. Whether it takes 24 hours or 23 hours and 59 and whatever minutes it takes, it's still one a day. And that's what important concept that you have to keep in mind if you're going to understand the calendar. What is a day? It's one revolution of the earth. And so then we go from there, we go to Genesis 14. Then God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens, and divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons, for days and for years, and let them be for lights in the firmament of heaven to give light on the earth." And it was so. Then God made 2 great lights. It says then. That's not really the way it is. If you go to the original, it just said God made the lights. That's what it says. So they added that to make it sound better and to actually conform with the idea that God made these things at that time. He didn't make them at that time. Obviously, we already realized that he was standing on, or the earth was already created. It was there. So he didn't make it then. And the interesting verse is verse 17. And God set them in the firmament of heaven to give light on the earth. When it says that, he set them, you see, our universe is, in fact, a giant clock that God has. It's his clock. That's how he actually, or how we see how he actually measures time for us. It's the movement of these heavenly bodies, and that's what makes time. And so when we look at that, we see, what do we see? We see, it says that, what is the sun there for? The sun is there for what? Days, one revolution, and years. What does it take? It takes 365, and not quite, a quarter, to make one trip around the sun. While that's happening, the moon is spinning about the earth. And so we have here a system. We first recognize that we have a system that God calls years, right? Then we have another system when we recognize what that means about the moon is appointments. And so the average time for the moon to circle the earth is 29 and a half days. It's a little bit more. And so this is something we need to keep in mind. All of this information I had to, some of it, of course, you didn't know, but some I had to redo. So we know God keeps like two kinds of calendars. When he's talking about years, he's talking about solar years. In other words, when he goes into the Bible and he tells you Adam lived for 900 and some years, he means 900 and some trips around the sun. That's what he means. When he's talking in other times, when he's mentioning other things, he's talking about a different calendar, a different kind of a calendar. And that's where we're going to go into the flood calendar. And here we see this. And God said to Noah, "The end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood, make rooms in the ark, cover it inside and outside with pitch, and this is how you shall make it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, its height 50 cubits. You shall make a window for the ark, and you shall finish it to a cubit from above, and set the door of the ark in its side, and you shall make it with a lower and second and third decks." Then the Lord said to Noah, "Come into the ark." This is Genesis 7, verse 1. And he tells him, he built the ark. So he tells him to come in. Now, I got this picture of the ark because it probably is more like what the ark really looked like. It was really more of a box. It didn't have a bow or a stern on it because it wasn't going anywhere. I mean, it was just going to float. That's the whole idea. Now, you notice at the top you can see some kind of apertures, and there's a lot of them, windows. And I just would like to point out the fact that those windows were very necessary, and there were more than one window. And the construction, you notice the construction of the windows is almost into the center. I don't know that that necessarily was the way it was, but you get the idea. If you had a single window, what would happen to all of the animals and the humans on board that boat or that box? They would die from lack of oxygen. And it would be really kind of smelly. So you understand that they had to have a system for ventilation, and the windows were the system for ventilation. Now, if they had windows that allowed air to come in, we'd think like windows, glass windows, right? I mean, this is the way we think today. But that doesn't necessarily mean that those windows were glass windows. And as an aside, I believe that they were making glass at that time. Why do I believe that? Well, because they were making iron and copper and at that time. All you have to do is turn back a couple of pages in your Bible and read the account, and you'll see that the sons of, who is it? Oh, my memory fails me. Lamech, right. His sons were artisans, and he had the three sons, and one, of course, dealt in the metals. And if he dealt in the metals, it's no big trick to think that if he's melting iron, this takes a lot of heat. And if he's melting iron, he's going to melt sand, and he's going to be able to see that you can make glass. Now, it doesn't say that, but all you have to do is think a little bit about it and say, well, these guys were no dummies. They were pretty advanced. And so as we go further into this idea here, the important thing about this is I just want you to keep in mind the windows. Because we're going to go, and then it says, for 7 more days I will cause it to rain on the earth, 40 days and 40 nights, and I will destroy from the face of the earth all the living things that I have made. And Noah did according to the Lord's command. He was 600 years old when the flood waters were on the earth. 600 years, earth going around the sun. This is years. Okay? Now we go further. So Noah and his sons and his wife's sons went into the ark because of the waters of the flood. And it came to pass after 7 days that the waters of the flood were on the earth. Oh, that's 7 days. That's an interesting number, isn't it? How many days between from Sabbath to Sabbath? 7 days. And so, why do you think God put 7 days in there? Because he wanted us to recognize that when he was talking to Noah and his family, it was the Sabbath. If you carefully study, you will see that God basically talked to his people on the Sabbath, or some high day Sabbath it could be. And so, if we recognize, that's something that we should recognize. You will be able to see this in a calendar. I'm going to show you a calendar that shows this. And the rain was on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. On that very same day, Noah and his sons, Shem and Ham and Japheth, and Noah's wife and the 3 wives of his sons with them entered the ark. So here we understand that there was 40 days of rain. Well, this is an important piece of information we have to keep in mind. Now the flood was on the earth 40 days. The waters increased and lifted up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed and greatly increased on the earth, and the ark moved up on the surface of the waters. And the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. And this is an important consideration. There was that much water. But there was more water to come. The waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered. So the mountains were covered. Now, and all in whose nostrils was the breath of the Spirit of life, all that was on the dry land died. So he destroyed all living things which were on the face of the ground, both man and cattle, creeping things, and birds of the air were destroyed from the earth. Only Noah and those who were with him in the ark remained alive. And the waters prevailed for 150 days. So what do we have? We have God raised 40 days it took him to raise the waters, and then he spends 150 days. He maintains the water. How does he maintain it? Through rain. That's how he maintains it. It continued to rain. Not not in torrents and all the rest that we saw in the initial 40 days. But he did it so that the water level would be maintained. Then God remembered Noah and every living thing and all the animals that were with him in the ark. And the fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven were stopped, and the rain of heaven was restrained, and the waters receded continually from the earth. At the end of 150 days, the waters decreased. So we see that. So here is a compilation of the time, as you can see. When did they go into the ark? It was the second month, right? So you have the first month. Well, if you're a mathematician, in which God is a supreme mathematician, if you have a figure that's is over half, what do? You carry it to the next day or the next unit of time. And in this case, the first month would be 30 days. And then 16 days, which would be a day before they went into the ark, because they went in on the 17th. So you would have 30, 16, 40, 150. That equals 236 days before the water started to recede. And then the next 150 days, you come to 386. And see, when I did that first reading and first studying, and I started putting together these days, I said, 386? And I thought about it, and I said, that number is kind of like a Hebrew calculated calendar number. So when I started thinking about this is exactly what I thought of. So then you see this, the ark rested in the 7th month, in the 17th day of the month on the mountain of Ararat. Okay, so if we add up the days to get to that particular time, it's 30, 29, 30, 29, 30, 29, because they're alternating months. When you steal a half a day from the following month, it can only have 29 days. And so that's why when you add up the count on the 17th, 29, the 17th day of the 7th month. So if you add all that up, you get to 194 days, don't you? Because the 7th month, of course, would be 30 days, but you only have 17 days in there. So you have 194 days. The point is that the water didn't start to recede until 236 days were passed. So what that meant is there's a problem we have here. Because we know, obviously, here's Mount Ararat, 1,700 feet. Here's Mount Everest, 29,000 feet. And in my article that I wrote about this subject, I put that in there, and somebody came along and said, probably Mount Everest wasn't in existence at that time, because this is what God raised up to make hollows for the water to go into. That's what we call the oceans. And so, he's got a point there. But the point is basically really mute, because, first of all, we should know about the word rested. And the word rested, meaning it rests, settled down, remains, repose, have rest. This is a word that is used when we talk about the seventh-day rest. That's the same word. You're going to see an interesting thing when we look at the calendar for this particular year about that particular day. So, in fact, what it's really saying is God brought the ark where he wanted it, and he just maintained it there, that's all. It just stayed there. It's where he wanted it. It wasn't stuck on the top of the mountain. It just wasn't. It was just staying where he wanted it to stay. Now, that's it's kind of an important understanding as we go through this presentation. The number of days during the flood was 386 minus 40 was 346 days. The reason that I show that is because some people say, well, you don't really know what you're talking about, because that 40 days was really part of the 150 days where God maintained the level of the water. And I said, that can't be, because if you did that, instead of what you would have is you'd have the 386 days that we originally added up, right? You take the 40 days out because you're saying it's part of the 150, and you end up with 346 days. Is there anyone here can tell me where you have a year of 346 days? Doesn't exist. Never has existed. It isn't part of God's calendar. It isn't the way he keeps time. So clearly, you cannot say that. This is an important realization, because what we're going to see is, and God came, and it came to pass in the 601st year, in the first month, the first day of the month, the waters were dried up off of the earth, and Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and behold, the face of the ground was dry. And in the second month, and it continues on. But the important thing is to recognize is, all of a sudden, Noah is what? He's no longer 600 years old. He's now 601 years. So, now, I kind of did a little work with that number, but it isn't, I guess it really isn't all that important. But it just shows that look at what we have in this one story about the flood. We have years developed, we have days developed, we have Sabbath days in there. In fact, it's going to be really interesting when you see the calendar. Now, you have all of this information put into the story of the flood. Why can't I say this is in fact a calendar? He's showing you how you should have a calendar. So God, let's go back to that other scripture, okay? The reason that I want to go back there is because there's an important piece of information that is embedded in that. And it came to pass in the 601st year of the first month, the first day of the month, the waters were dry up. It's the first day, see? So 386, you have to subtract the day. So what do you end up with? 385. You know what 385 days is? It's the maximum length of a Hebrew calculated calendar year. Now, when you first say that, well, what is so important about that? Well, if he showed any other year, you could say, oh, that's just the way it is. But if he shows you, this is the maximum number. There is no other number beyond that. And it matches the Hebrew calculated calendar. So therefore, that is an important number. Something that we need to recognize. In addition to that, you'll notice that he took the covering off, and then he looked down at the ground to see that it was dried. Think about that. You mean he couldn't open the window and look down and see if the ground was dry? Did he have to send out this dove and take it in and send it out? The reason is very clear. Those windows were set back, just like it showed in the drawing. Whether they were set back that far, I don't know. But when you think about that, those windows had to have an overhang to prevent what? Water from coming in. They had to have it waterproof, but they had to let air in. And so therefore, those windows, that whole construction was made with a covering, covered that, and the windows were set back. So all he could look down and see wood when he looked down, when he opened the window. He couldn't see the ground. This is an important consideration for you to keep in mind. because it tells you about the construction of the ark. That's what it tells you. And it's also explains why he went through all this. Why didn't he just open the window and look down? Well, he couldn't, because the way the ark was made, he couldn't do it. And in addition to not being able to look down, he also could not look up. They had no windows in the ceiling. He only had the windows, so all he could do is look out at the horizon. That's why when you read the account, it says he could see the mountaintops when it started sinking. They could see the tops of the mountains. That was the first thing they could see, but they couldn't see anything else. In addition to that, I would like to ask you the question, now that we've gone this far and you understand what is happening. I ask you the question, how did he know that it was the 7th month? Right away you say, well, he must have counted. Precisely. He counted. How did he know that it was the 17th day of the 7th month? Because it was a calculated day. That's why. He calculated it. It was calculated. He knew how to calculate it. See, a lot of people, they write things, they'd say, oh, the calendar was done by Moses. The calendar wasn't done by Moses. The calendar was done by God. He set the calendar. It's really quite clear. When you take a look at all of the scriptures that we have looked at here today, this is the way it is. Now, let's take a look. Here is the compilation of the number of days during the flood, 346. This is without that 40. I already took care of that. Let's go to the next slide that I have here. One more, please. That's it, right there. That's the compilation. Now, the flood began on the 17th day of the 2nd month. So the first month, we already established, has to have 30 days in it. If you put something other than 30 days in that first month, you are not a very good mathematician. It's the way it is. That's the math. You can't move it. And so 30 days in the first month, 16 days up in the 2nd month, that's 46 days. It rained 40 days and 40 nights. There's the 40 days. The water prevailed 150 days. The water abated 150 days, 386 days. You take away because it ended on the first day of the next year, you take that day away and it comes to 385 days. That is the length of the year of the flood, 385 days. And I'll bet everybody thinks, well, it should have been 365, but it was 385. And this is the importance of that mathematics. That's what it's about. Here is a calendar. Now, you have to just take my word for it that I've done the work on this. That I can tell you that the year, the AM, you see it says AM 1661. You know what AM means? Whenever you see this, somebody writes something and they've used the AM year, they're talking about after man. In other words, they're talking about from the week of creation to this flood was 1,661 years. And the BC year was 2386. Now, I went through a lot of work it took me, this isn't something that I want you to think I just, sat down one time and wrote it all out and that was it. It took me 3 years and a lot of sweat and effort went into those 3 years. The fact is, at one point I gave up and I said, can't do it. About 30 days later, God said to me, get back to work. We're going to show you how it's done. And then, the proper information, this I kind of started realizing what I needed to do. And I made other charts that eventually proved to give us this end product. And as you can see, there's the year of the flood. And let me see. There's the 7th month right there. See, Tishri 3. That year, the Feast of Trumpets was not on a Sabbath. It was on a Thursday. See, you can tell that. See how neat this is? You can tell. In fact, as I was showing the gentleman in back how he could look in this calendar and see, all he had to do was put in the date that he was married. And it showed, he was married on a Sunday. The calendar shows this. This calendar is composed only of 7-day increments. The black line is the BC, in this case BC years, could be AD, depending on where you're at. It's the Gregorian date. People say the Gregorian calendar is leaky. The Gregorian calendar is a very accurate calendar. It takes a lot of years. We would have to be in BC 6000 before it made any difference day-wise, the calendar. That's how far out it would have to go. But that's neither here nor there. You see the black is the Gregorian. The red is the Hebrew calculated, and the blue is the solar calendar. Now, the solar calendar is any calendar that anyone comes up with that doesn't agree with that solar calendar has to be wrong, because that solar calendar is based on 7-day increments. The Hebrew calendar also uses 7-day increments, so it's right there, and so does the Gregorian calendar. It uses 7-day increments, and God made it that way so that he couldn't change the Sabbath. He could not change. When Gregory made that change, he could not change the Sabbath. That was fixed. And so that shows this. So you can see here there was the 2nd month, and you have the 10th, the 17th. There was that 10th was when God spoke to Moses and his family. The 17th is when the flood started, and you can see there's the 7th month, and you know what that 17th day was? A Sabbath, wasn't it? It came, what did the ark do on the 17th day of the month? It rested, that's right. It rested, and that is a Sabbath rest. And so you see how that completes the cycle. Now, I show you this calendar. The reality is that what I did is I created a skeletonized calendar. I mentioned this, in which I call it Chart 3. It only gives you the Sabbath of the solar calendar and the first Sabbath in January for the Gregorian calendar. But if you wanted to go through all the work and effort, you would find this. But what I did is I hired a group of programmers to develop a program so that all you would have to do was go in there, into that program, place the date that you wanted to look at, and it would produce this calendar for you. It would tell you when the Passover is, when the first day of unleavened bread, the last day of unleavened bread, the Pentecost, the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, Tabernacles, and the last great day. They're all there. They all have the date, so you can find out. And this is, I can't tell you how, this is very important information, because it tells you some things that you would never suspect without that piece of information. And so that's the reason for it. Sure, go ahead. Absolutely.
So that would verify then that agrees with what our Ezekiel said. And you say, oh, we have to,
It's no work to our present day. This is, when I first started this work, I sat down with a pencil and a paper and I started putting sevens down. And I'm coming forward in increments of 7. I said, you can't be fooled if you're using increments of 7. It's the week. It's one of the time frames that God uses. It's an absolute. It's like the day. It's so important. And I started doing that. I had pages and pages of this. And easy to make a mistake. But when you're going along, when you're doing that, you realize, this doesn't add up, so I got a mistake someplace. I got to go back. And so I was at the feast when I had started before I went to the feast, and I brought the papers, and I showed this to another engineer, Clifford. His name is Clifford, too. He's a Chinese man. And I showed him, I said, look at what I'm doing. He said, I can do this on the computer. 2 days later, he gives me the job finished, and I had been working weeks on this, trying to do this. And so these are things that, I do not want to claim any kind of, in fact, I do not claim any kind of, exceptional knowledge that allowed me, because I'm so smart, I was able to figure all this stuff out by myself. And it's not because I was so smart, it's because God caused me to do this work. And he didn't let me stop. When I wanted to stop, I said, I'm finished. I'm not making any more headway here. I'm stopping. And okay, I'll give you a rest for 30 days. Then we're going to put you back to work. And my son here, he's going to give you some extra help. Well, that's what it means to be fed. He feeds us. That's how we understand what's in this book. And it's not because we're so smart and intelligent. It's because he feeds us. He gives us the information that allows us to understand what's in here. Yes?
On your Hebrew calendar there in red, does that take into consideration the lunar? Because you begin your months.
See, it's a good thing you asked that question. She wants to know if I used lunar months, right? Okay. A lady, what was her name? Well, it didn't matter. She was part of the Hebrew roots. And she questioned me. She said, well, what are you using in there? Are you using the first crescent or the dark of the moon? What moon are you using? I mean, how are you doing this? And I said, I don't use any moon. And she was, over the phone, she was really surprised. I said, I'll explain this to you. If you would go back, which I don't have the calendar, but if you would go back to the first calendar, the year 1, AM, you would find that it's really quite simple, that the calendar, just as your Sabbath days were set, God set the holy days at the same time. They were set at that point in time and have never changed. And the reason you know that is because you go there, you say, oh, creation, 7 days. 7 days after that would be what? It would be the 14th, wouldn't it? 7 days of creation, 7 more days of the 14th. That's the Passover. The Passover is on that year is on a Saturday. And you know, all you do is you come forward mathematically with your 30, 29, 30, 29, 30, 29, and you come to the Feast of Trumpets. And what do you want to change in there? That's my question. What is it that you want to move? Because we're talking about weeks and days. You can't move it. You cannot move that Feast of Trumpets. And then if you continue on in the same pattern. 30, 29, 30, 29, and you come to the second year. And you would find the day, I don't remember, but you would find the day for Passover. You see, Passover actually tells you when the feasts are, what days they're on. It's just the opposite. You talk to the Jewish people, and they say, "Oh, you have to find out when the trumpets is, and then you figure backwards, and then you come to Passover." No, you don't. You start with Passover, and then you find out when trumpets is. Oh, there is no postponements. You know why there are no postponements? Because it's mathematically, it's the way the math works. I'll explain this postponements because sometimes this gets a little hairy. People, they look at this. I hear the Jews there, they don't want to have 2 fast days in a row or this or that, and they have all these rules that they use. And the rules were used because they were coming into the middle of the calendar. They didn't know where they were at. So they used those rules, and they rules basically would give them the correct time. But in fact, you don't need any rules. All you need to do is know the lengths of time that we're talking about. Now, it is pretty clear. I showed the gentleman, Mike. I showed Mike. I said, take a look and see if you can see on the calendar. We went to the calendar generator, and I said, take a look at what day it says, this day that we are observing. What is that? That's one of the 7 days that I brought forward from creation. That's today. It's the Sabbath. That's it. Absolutely. Unequivocally. You cannot move it. What day do you want to take out? People question me about Joshua's long day. Oh, wow, what do you do with Joshua's long day? Well, what happened on Joshua's long day? God stopped the sun and the moon. They didn't move. The earth didn't move. The clock stopped. He stopped his clock. When he started it up, it came to the end of whatever day that was. I use the example like it was Thursday. Then when he started it up, it came to the end of Thursday and Friday started. Didn't change anything. Hezekiah, he moved the clock back. He didn't change the day. Nothing happened. There was no day removed from the calendar. It's all there. My thinking on how I came to understand this was I said, if I go back far enough and I start at creation and come forward, I will come to this date. I will come to a time when I will be able to see a 385 days, right? Yes, 385 days. I'll find a 385-day year, and that's exactly what I did. Guess that's why 1661 is the year of the flood, because it has a 385-day year. It's tied together. You cannot move it. It's absolute. And so the idea, I said, I'm here to increase your faith, right? And that's exactly what I did. I revealed to you what the Bible shows as far as the passage of time is concerned. Now, you might say, Why is this important? Who remembers that in a certain book it says 42 months? How long is 42 months? Yeah, no, it isn't 3.5 years. Not the way God keeps times. It's either it's 3 years and 11 months or 3 years and 10 months, depending on when you want to take that piece of time out of the calendar. It always is that way. And so when you're looking, you see, this is why I was able to go back to Daniel 9, and I can document. It's documented. Most of you may know that the scholars, what did they say is the year that the temple was destroyed, Solomon's temple was destroyed? 386, or 586, 585, or 587. That's what they say. I can absolutely prove to you that that's wrong. The reason I can do that is all I have to do is go to those years on my calendar, and I have to look to see, do we know that the temple was destroyed at the going out of the 9th, and it was destroyed on the 10th. The fire was started on the 10th. So the 5th month has to have a Sabbath of the 9th. If it doesn't, temple wasn't destroyed then. And that's exactly, you look at those 3 years, and they're not even close. Not even close. You see, this is one of the problems when you get old. Oh, 13-month year. Right.
So when you say 385 days, you're talking about
A third.
here, which has an added month of it. But how can that be? That's because the months are either 29 days long or 30 days long, not 30 or, well, it would be 31. So, so the calculations then will determine, in the 19-year time cycle, they start calculating backward in 19-year increments rather than,
The interesting thing is that when you look at the calculated calendar, there's a lot of interesting things that are obvious in that calendar. And one of them is, when I used the calculated calendar, I did not use it as the Jews use it. I used it differently. And the reason I say that is because the Jews have a certain rotation for these for those 19-year time cycles. And that is not the correct rotation to have. The reason is really quite clear. If you would take the time to look at their calendar, you would find that they believe that the creation was in the 7th month. Now, I ask you, when their rules would prevent, their own rules that they have, would prevent the creation from being there, because the Sabbath would end up on the wrong day. It wouldn't be on a 7th day. It's not possible. And now I called the rabbis. I tried to talk to them, supposedly the head rabbi in Milwaukee, and, I'll tell you what I got from him. Well, some believe this and some believe that. And so by the time you end up, you didn't really know what they believed.
I would be fascinated at your calendar, but I would also like to see, like, the new moons placed on there, where those fell on.
There is a gentleman by the name of Dan Day, who was a researcher for Fred Coulter. You probably know that name. Okay. And what he did is he took the Hebrew calculated calendar dates and he inserted them in a graph. And then he took what was the sighting of the new moon. And what he found is that sometimes it would be above the line, sometimes it would be below the line, sometimes it would come right on the line. But the calculated calendar, it results in a straight line when you graph it. And so this was his findings. And right, and clearly there was no way for Noah to observe any kind of a moon. So he had to know how to calculate the time. That's why a lot of people write, they said, well, this is Moses' calendar. No, it's not Moses' calendar. He gave Moses the job of instituting it and the priesthood the responsibility for reporting it. But it's God's calendar, and it started at creation. Once you see unfortunately, I can't put that up, but should have thought of that, but didn't think of everything. But if you would see how those days fall, you realize, oh, wow, I guess we can't move it. They're fixed. They were fixed. And when you say it, I mean, think about this. We firmly believe that the Sabbath is a fixed day. What do they call the high days? They're called Sabbaths. They're my Sabbaths. And they were fixed at creation along with everything else is fixed. It's
What does it mean that the sun and moon are to be what controls the calendar?
well, let me give you another piece of information that a lot of people don't understand. When you read the new moon, in the New and in the Old and the New Testament, when you read that terminology, the reality is the terminology there is the first day of the month. That's all. It's not new moon. It's the first day of the month. And so, obviously, God would want his people to know what his calendar is. I mean, he isn't trying to hide this, I'm trying to be, this is real secretive. You have to figure out when I want you to observe the Day of Atonement. He wants you to know that when that day is. Any other questions? Yes?
The Hebrew calendar is based on the months.
Oh, yes. There is no doubt about it. There is no doubt. And God's calendar, we read that he put the moon there for a reason. I have no argument with that. The thing is that what you're seeing here is factual. What I've done is mathematically and calendrically, I've proven that this book is very, very, very accurate. I've written I start with creation. I've written about creation. I've written about the flood. It's all in writing. I've written about the Exodus. That's another very interesting, I could go on. There's just tons of information out there.
But that's what he revealed the calendar to his people.
That's right. He revealed the calendar to his people. They had to know the calendar. It isn't something that wasn't in operation. It started at creation. That's it? No. No. We don't do that. We don't do that. Right.
Thanks, Don.
You're welcome.